The sound of fists smacking against flesh echoed through the quiet park as three teenagers surrounded an elderly Asian man. Their jeers and laughter pierced the evening air, loud and cruel, bouncing off the tall oaks that lined the deserted trail. A couple of onlookers hurried past, their eyes darting away to avoid the escalating confrontation. The old man, slight and stooped, gripped his cane tightly as he tried to shield himself from their taunts. "What's the matter, old man?" shouted Bryce, the ringleader, his blond hair glowing in the fading sunlight. He shoved the man's shoulder, hard enough to make him stagger. "Don't you understand English?" The man's expression remained calm, but his grip on the cane tightened. He said nothing, his eyes scanning the teens with a peculiar calm that should have been unsettling but wasn't, yet. "Hey, let's teach him a lesson!" Bryce's friend Kevin yelled, his voice laced with a mix of bravado and uncertainty. He balled his fist and took a swing at the old man's face. The attack was slow, sloppy, and entirely unprepared for what followed. In a flash, the elderly man moved. He stepped aside with a grace that defied his age, his cane hooking Kevin's arm and yanking him off balance. Kevin's punch landed on thin air, and his momentum sent him sprawling into the dirt. Before Bryce and the third teen, Josh, could process what had just happened, the old man spun the cane in his hand, its curved end now pointing toward them. "You have no idea who you're messing with," the man said, his voice quiet but firm, tinged with an accent. For the first time, his eyes narrowed, flashing with a sharpness that could slice through steel. Bryce lunged forward, aiming a wild punch at the man. In an instant, the cane lashed out, striking Bryce's wrist with a precision that made him yelp and drop to his knees. The sound of cracking would reverberated as the old man twirled his cane, his stance suddenly reminiscent of something you'd see in an action movie. Josh froze, his face pale, and took a cautious step back. "Run," Josh stammered, tugging at Bryce's sleeve. "Let's just go." But Bryce wasn't ready to surrender his ego. "You think you're tough, old man? This isn't over." The old man smiled faintly. "I'm giving you a chance to walk away." Before Bryce could respond, a police car turned the corner, its siren a distant but growing wail. The teenagers scattered into the trees, leaving the old man standing alone, his cane planted firmly in the ground. The officer's voice crackled over the loudspeaker, demanding the teens to stop, but they had already vanished into the night. As the adrenaline began to fade, the old man leaned on his cane, adjusting his collar. For a brief moment, he appeared fragile again, just another senior citizen trying to navigate a world that often looked past him. But anyone who had witnessed what had just happened knew better. What had caused these boys to target him? And how had he mastered the art of combat so seamlessly? Stay tuned as we unravel the events leading up to this dramatic showdown. If you're intrigued by this story and want to hear more, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Let's dive deeper into the mystery. Earlier that day, the park had been serene. Birds chirped from the trees, families picnicked on the grass, and joggers passed each other with polite nods. The elderly man, Mr. Lee, sat on a bench, his cane resting beside him. He watched the world with quiet contentment, a book of haikus open on his lap. To anyone passing by, he seemed like just another retiree enjoying the sunshine. But behind his calm demeanor lay decades of discipline, struggle, and a life shaped by his unyielding commitment to martial arts. In his younger years, Mr. Lee had been a celebrated karate coach in his hometown. He had trained countless students, earning respect for his unmatched skill and unwavering principles. His black belt was not just a mark of his proficiency but a symbol of the philosophy he lived by, strength tempered with compassion. However, when he immigrated to the United States years ago, he had left that life behind, choosing instead to live quietly, blending into the background. As the afternoon wore on, Mr. Lee's peace was disrupted by a group of teenagers, Bryce, Kevin, and Josh. They had been wandering the park aimlessly, their loud laughter and boisterous behavior drawing disapproving glances from other visitors. Bryce, the leader, spotted Mr. Lee sitting alone and nudged his friends. "Hey, check out the old guy," he said, smirking. "Bet he doesn't even speak English." Kevin laughed, but Josh hesitated. "Come on, man. Let's just keep walking." Bryce ignored him, striding over to Mr. Lee with Kevin following close behind. They loomed over him, their shadows cutting across the pages of his book. Mr. Lee looked up, his face calm but alert. "What are you reading, old man?" Bryce asked, his tone mocking. Something in Chinese. Mr. Lee closed his book and placed it on the bench beside him. It's Japanese, he replied, his voice steady. A book of haikus. Bryce snorted. Yeah, whatever. Bet you can't even understand it. I understand enough, Mr. Lee said, meeting Bryce's gaze. His calmness only seemed to irritate the teenager further. Kevin chimed in. Why don't you go back to where you came from? Mr. Lee's grip tightened imperceptibly on his cane. This is where I am now, he said. Why don't you sit and learn something? Bryce laughed derisively, grabbing the book from the bench. What this? Teach us some ancient kung fu tricks, old man. He flipped through the pages, pretending to read aloud in gibberish. Kevin joined in, while Josh stood a few steps away, his discomfort evident. Put the book down, Mr. Lee said, his voice sharper this time. Or what? Bryce taunted, waving the book just out of Mr. Lee's reach. Before Mr. Lee could respond, a jogger passed by, eyeing the scene with concern. Hey, leave him alone, she called out. Bryce turned to her with a scowl. Mind your own business. The jogger hesitated, then continued on, glancing back once before disappearing around a bend. Bryce turned back to Mr. Lee, tossing the book onto the ground. There, you can have it back. No harm, right? Mr. Lee bent down slowly, retrieving the book. When he straightened, his eyes bore into Bryce with a quiet intensity. You should be careful whom you disrespect, he said softly. Bryce rolled his eyes. Yeah, sure. Let's go, guys. As the teens walked away, Kevin and Bryce laughed, but Josh kept glancing over his shoulder. Mr. Lee watched them go, his fingers brushing the worn cover of his book. He knew their paths would cross again, and when they did, the lesson would be one they'd never forget. What do you think about Mr. Lee's calm reaction so far? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this story, make sure to like and subscribe to our channel for more interesting tales. The evening sun cast long shadows across the park as Mr. Lee made his way home. The quiet rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant chatter of children playing gave the park an air of tranquility, a deceptive calm that masked what was about to unfold. As he crossed a narrow footbridge, Mr. Lee's sharp ears picked up the crunch of hurried footsteps behind him. Hey, old man! Bryce's voice cut through the stillness. Mr. Lee stopped and turned slowly. Bryce, Kevin, and Josh stood at the other end of the bridge. Their postures were tense, their expressions determined. But it wasn't just the three of them this time. Two more boys, older and bulkier, flanked the group, smirking as if they already knew how this would end. You thought you could embarrass us and just walk away? Bryce sneered. Mr. Lee's eyes moved between the boys, assessing the situation. Despite the odds, his face betrayed no fear. Instead, he adjusted his grip on the cane and stepped forward calmly. This is unnecessary, he said. Go home. We'll decide what's necessary, one of the larger boys, Tyler, said, cracking his knuckles. Teach this guy a lesson. Kevin hesitated, glancing nervously at Josh, but Bryce and Tyler surged forward. The others followed, emboldened by the show of aggression. Mr. Lee's stance shifted subtly, his weight centered, his cane held loosely in his hand. He let them come closer, his movements deliberate and measured. Bryce threw the first punch, wild and uncoordinated, and Mr. Lee sidestepped with ease, using the momentum to trip him with the cane. Bryce hit the ground with a loud thud, groaning in pain. Tyler lunged next, his size making him confident. But Mr. Lee was faster. He spun, the cane striking Tyler's shin with a sharp crack. Tyler stumbled, and Mr. Lee delivered a swift jab to his stomach, sending him gasping for air. The other boys froze, their bravado replaced with doubt. Stop this now, Mr. Lee warned, his voice firm. But the boys weren't ready to back down. One of the newcomers, a wiry teen named Mason, pulled a metal rod from his jacket and swung it wildly. The sight of the weapon sent a jolt through the group, even Kevin and Josh. Mr. Lee's eyes narrowed. He sidestepped the rod swing, gripping Mason's wrist with surprising strength. In one fluid motion, he twisted Mason's arm, forcing the rod to clatter to the ground. Mason yelped in pain and stumbled back, clutching his wrist. The fight seemed to drain out of the group after that. Kevin and Josh stayed rooted in place, neither willing to step forward. Bryce, still on the ground, glared up at Mr. Lee, his pride wounded more than his body. "You think this is over?" Bryce spat, his voice shaky. "We'll get you next time, old man." Mr. Lee stared at him, his expression unreadable. Then, with deliberate slowness, he picked up the metal rod and handed it back to Mason. "Use your hands to build, not to harm," he said, his voice calm but firm. He turned and walked away, leaving the boys to grapple with their humiliation. As Mr. Lee disappeared down the path, Bryce scrambled to his feet. "We're not done yet," he muttered, his face red with anger. The others exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to follow Bryce or cut their losses. The following day, Bryce nursed his bruised pride as much as his aching wrist. He sat in his room, scrolling through his phone, replaying the events of the previous evening. The humiliation burned, but underneath it simmered something darker. "We need to figure out who this guy is," he muttered, sending a message to the group chat. Kevin and Josh hesitated before responding. Josh finally typed back, "Maybe we should just let it go?" Kevin's reply was more pointed, "Bryce, we're lucky he didn't call the cops." But Bryce wasn't ready to move on. "He can't just get away with embarrassing us," he muttered to himself. A quick online search of the local community forums brought up a post from earlier that year. "Meet Mr. Lee, our local karate legend." The article detailed Mr. Lee's life story, his years as a karate coach, his championship titles, and his dedication to mentoring young people. The post even included a picture of him standing with students at his old dojo. Bryce stared at the screen, a mix of anger and disbelief coursing through him. "So he's some big-shot black belt," he scoffed, forwarding the article to the group chat. "Guess he's not just some random old dude." Josh replied almost immediately, "See? This is why we should drop it." But Bryce wasn't listening. His mind raced with plans to even the score, none of which involved backing down. He slammed his laptop shut and headed out, ignoring his mother's call to come back for dinner. Meanwhile, Mr. Lee sat in his modest home, sipping a cup of green tea. His small living room was lined with mementos from his past, framed certificates, photos of students, and a rack of worn black belts. He stared out the window, his thoughts lingering on the incident at the park. A knock at the door broke his reverie. When he opened it, he found Mrs. Carter, a neighbor who often brought him fresh baked goods. Tonight, she held a box of cookies and a worried expression. "Mr. Lee, I heard what happened," she said, her voice tinged with concern. "Some kids in the park. Are you okay?" Mr. Lee nodded, offering a small smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Carter. I'm fine. They're just children, misguided but not beyond help." Mrs. Carter frowned. "You're too kind, but you need to be careful. These aren't the same kids we grew up with." Mr. Lee chuckled softly. "Times change, but respect and discipline are lessons that never go out of style." She left with a worried glance over her shoulder, and Mr. Lee returned to his tea, his mind more focused now. He sensed that Bryce and his friends weren't done. Though he hoped they would learn from their mistakes, he prepared for the possibility that they wouldn't. Later that night, Bryce met up with the group at their usual hangout spot, a dimly lit basketball court on the edge of the neighborhood. This time, Tyler and Mason brought along more friends, their numbers swelling to 7. The atmosphere crackled with tension as Bryce laid out his plan. "We're going to his house," Bryce announced. "Show him he's not untouchable." Josh's face drained of color. "Are you crazy? That's breaking and entering." "We're not breaking in," Bryce snapped. "Just sending a message. Let him know he can't mess with us." Kevin looked uneasy but didn't object. The others nodded, their bravado fueled by numbers. Only Josh hung back, his feet rooted to the ground as the group started toward Mr. Lee's street. "This is a bad idea," Josh muttered to himself, watching his friends disappear into the night. He turned and walked in the opposite direction, his heart pounding. Mr. Lee heard them before he saw them. The shuffle of feet on his gravel driveway and the hushed whispers broke the stillness of the night. He stood by the window, his cane resting against the wall. His sharp eyes scanned the group gathering outside, their faces partially obscured by the shadows. With a deep breath, Mr. Lee moved to the front door. He opened it before they had a chance to knock, startling the boys. Bryce stepped forward, his bravado flickering for a moment before he regained his composure. "We're not scared of you, old man," Bryce said, though his voice wavered slightly. Mr. Lee tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "You came all this way to tell me that?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with a quiet authority. The group shifted uneasily, their plan suddenly seeming less certain. Bryce clenched his fists, unwilling to back down. The night air was thick with tension as Bryce and his group stood on Mr. Lee's doorstep. The soft glow of the porchlight illuminated their uncertain faces, contrasting sharply with Mr. Lee's calm, unreadable expression. The older man's grip on his cane tightened slightly, though his voice remained steady. "You boys have made a habit of bad decisions," Mr. Lee said, stepping out onto the porch. "What do you want from me?" Bryce squared his shoulders, trying to muster the confidence he had flaunted earlier. "We want you to know you can't just humiliate us and get away with it," he said. "We're not afraid of you." The group murmured in agreement, but their nervous glances betrayed their uncertainty. Mason's hand hovered near his pocket, where he had stashed the metal rod from the previous night. Tyler, still nursing a bruised ego and a sore stomach, stood a step behind Bryce, his arms crossed. Mr. Lee's gaze swept over them, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. He stepped down from the porch, moving with the quiet grace of a predator sizing up its prey. The group instinctively stepped back, their bravado faltering under the weight of his calm confidence. "You think strength comes from numbers," Mr. Lee said, his voice low but firm. "But true strength comes from discipline and respect, neither of which I see in any of you." Bryce bristled. "You don't know anything about us." "I know enough," Mr. Lee replied. He raised his cane, not as a weapon but as a pointer, gesturing to each boy in turn. "You follow him because you're afraid to stand alone. You bring a weapon because you lack the confidence to fight without it. And you," he said, looking directly at Kevin, "have no place here. You're scared. That fear will get you into trouble far worse than this." Kevin's face flushed, and he took a step back, his eyes darting to the ground. Bryce's anger flared at the sight of his friend retreating. "Don't listen to him. He's just some washed-up old man trying to act tough." Mr. Lee smiled faintly, a hint of amusement in his expression. "Washed up, you say?" Before Bryce could respond, Mr. Lee moved. It was not an attack but a demonstration, a blur of precise, controlled motion. His cane swept through the air, tapping the ground inches from Bryce's feet, then spinning into a graceful arc that left the group awestruck. When he stopped, the cane was resting lightly against Tyler's chest, its curved end poised like the claw of a predator. "This is restraint," Mr. Lee said. "What you saw in the park was a warning. If I had wanted to hurt you, I could have. But violence is a last resort, not a solution." The group stood frozen, their bravado shattered. Even Bryce seemed unsure of his next move. But instead of retreating, he stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You think you can lecture us and we'll just back down?" Bryce snarled. "We don't need your stupid life lessons." "No," Mr. Lee said softly. "But you do need to understand consequences." He stepped back and lowered his cane. "Go home," he said. "If you continue down this path, you'll only hurt yourselves. And the next person you target may not be as patient as I am." For a moment, the group hesitated. Bryce's defiance flickered like a candle in the wind, his confidence wavering under Mr. Lee's steady gaze. Finally, Tyler muttered, "Let's go," and turned to leave. One by one, the others followed, their steps slow and reluctant. Only Bryce lingered, his fists still clenched, his face a mask of frustration. "This isn't over," he said, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and humiliation. Mr. Lee didn't respond. He simply watched as Bryce stormed off, his cane resting lightly against the ground. When the last of the group disappeared into the shadows, Mr. Lee turned and stepped back into his house, closing the door behind him. But he knew this wasn't the end. Bryce's pride wouldn't let it be. The storm was far from over, and Mr. Lee would be ready. The group dispersed into the night, but the atmosphere was heavy with unease. Bryce walked ahead of the others, his fists still clenched, his mind swirling with anger and humiliation. Behind him, Kevin and Mason exchanged wary glances, while Tyler's normally cocky demeanor was subdued. Only Josh, walking at the rear, seemed relieved the confrontation had ended without anyone getting hurt. When they reached the basketball court, Bryce stopped abruptly and turned to face them. "We're not letting him get away with this," he said, his voice trembling with rage. "Bryce, come on," Kevin said, his tone pleading. "He's not just some old guy. He's dangerous. Did you see how fast he moved?" "Yeah," Mason chimed in, rubbing his still sore wrist. "That cane. He could have done a lot worse." Bryce's glare swept over them. "So, what? You're all scared now?" Josh stepped forward, his voice quiet but firm. "Maybe we should be. Look, Bryce, this isn't worth it. We're not going to win against someone like him. Let it go before it gets worse." Bryce's face twisted in frustration. He pointed at Josh. "If you're too much of a coward, then leave. But don't try to stop me." Josh held his ground. "I'm not scared of him," he said. "I'm scared of what this is turning you into. You're not acting like yourself, Bryce. You're just angry." For a moment, the group was silent. Bryce's eyes darted between them, looking for someone, anyone, to back him up. When no one spoke, he scoffed and turned away. "Fine," he snapped. "I'll handle it myself." The next day, Mr. Lee resumed his usual routine, walking through the park with his cane tapping rhythmically against the ground. He greeted familiar faces with a polite nod, but his mind was elsewhere. The encounter with the teenagers lingered in his thoughts. He hoped his words had made an impression, but he knew Bryce's anger might drive him to act recklessly. As he reached the edge of the park, a figure emerged from the trees. It was Josh, his hands shoved into his pockets, his shoulders hunched. Mr. Lee stopped, watching as the boy approached hesitantly. "Mr. Lee," Josh said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Mr. Lee replied, his tone neutral but not unkind. Josh shifted nervously. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. Bryce, he doesn't listen to anyone, but the rest of us, we shouldn't have gone along with it. It was wrong." Mr. Lee regarded him quietly for a moment before nodding. "It takes courage to admit when you've made a mistake," he said. "What matters is what you choose to do next." Josh looked relieved but still uneasy. I'm worried about Bryce. He's not letting this go. I think he might try something stupid." Mr. Lee's eyes narrowed slightly. "Do you know what he's planning?" Josh shook his head. "No, but he's angry. And when he's like this, he doesn't think straight." Mr. Lee placed a hand on Josh's shoulder. "Thank you for telling me. It shows you have a good heart. Leave Bryce to me. But remember, it's not too late to make better choices for yourself." Josh nodded and walked away, his steps lighter than before. Mr. Lee watched him go, a sense of foreboding settling over him. Bryce's anger was like a storm cloud on the horizon, and Mr. Lee knew it would only be a matter of time before it struck. That evening, Bryce stood in his garage, staring at a pile of tools and scrap metal. His anger had festered all day, growing into a plan that was reckless and ill-conceived. He grabbed a crowbar and swung it against a wooden beam, the sound echoing sharply in the enclosed space. His jaw clenched as he muttered to himself. "He thinks he's better than me," Bryce growled. "Thinks he can just humiliate me and get away with it." As he spoke, his grip on the crowbar tightened. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do, but he knew he needed to act. The thought of Mr. Lee's calm, confident expression only fueled his rage. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the neighborhood as Bryce trudged through the streets, the crowbar in his hand. His mind was a storm of anger, frustration, and humiliation. He wasn't sure what he was going to do when he reached Mr. Lee's house, but the thought of confronting the old man fueled his steps. Meanwhile, inside his modest home, Mr. Lee prepared for the night. His senses, honed by decades of discipline, told him trouble was near. He set his cane by the door and turned off most of the lights, letting the house settle into an unassuming quiet. Then he waited. A faint noise outside broke the stillness, the crunch of gravel underfoot. Mr. Lee moved to the window and saw Bryce standing in his driveway, the crowbar clutched tightly in his hands. The boy's posture was rigid, his face a mask of conflict. For a moment, Mr. Lee felt a pang of sadness. Bryce wasn't evil, he was lost, drowning in emotions he couldn't control. With a deep breath, Mr. Lee stepped onto the porch. "Bryce," he called softly. The boy flinched, clearly startled, but he didn't back away. "I'm not scared of you," Bryce said, his voice shaking slightly. He tightened his grip on the crowbar. "You think you're better than me, but you're not. You're just some old man with a stick." Mr. Lee tilted his head, his expression calm but serious. "You don't need to do this, Bryce. Put the crowbar down and talk to me." "Talk?" Bryce scoffed. "Why would I talk to you?" "Because you're angry," Mr. Lee replied. "And if you let that anger control you, it will destroy you. I've seen it happen before." Bryce hesitated, his resolve wavering. But his pride wouldn't let him back down completely. "You don't know anything about me," he said, his voice cracking. Mr. Lee stepped closer, his movements deliberate but non-threatening. "You're right. I don't know your struggles. But I do know that hurting others won't ease your pain. It will only make it worse." Bryce's grip on the crowbar loosened slightly, and tears welled up in his eyes. He took a shaky breath, his anger finally giving way to the weight of his emotions. I don't know what to do," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Lee reached out and gently placed a hand on Bryce's shoulder. "It's never too late to choose a better path," he said. "You've made mistakes, but that doesn't define who you are. What matters is what you do next." The crowbar slipped from Bryce's hands and clattered to the ground. He covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking as he cried. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Mr. Lee guided Bryce to the porch steps, where they sat in silence under the dim glow of the porch light. The next day, Bryce showed up at the park. He wasn't alone. Kevin, Josh, and even Mason followed behind him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. They stopped a few feet away from Mr. Lee, who was practicing slow, deliberate movements with his cane. Bryce stepped forward and cleared his throat. "Mr. Lee," he said, his voice steady but nervous. I want to learn. I want to do better." Mr. Lee turned to face the group, his expression softening. "Discipline, respect, and patience," he said. "Those are the first lessons. Are you ready to learn them?" Bryce nodded, and the others followed suit. Mr. Lee gestured for them to join him, and together they began practicing the basics of movement and balance. For the first time, the tension between them dissolved, replaced by a shared purpose. Months later, Bryce and his friends stood beside Mr. Lee at a community event, demonstrating what they had learned. The same park that had once been the site of their worst behavior now echoed with cheers and applause as they performed a routine of synchronized movements. After the event, Bryce approached Mr. Lee, a genuine smile on his face. "Thank you," he said simply. Mr. Lee placed a hand on his shoulder, his eyes filled with quiet pride. "Remember, Bryce, true strength comes from within. Never forget that." Bryce nodded, the weight of those words settling deeply within him. He looked out at the crowd, seeing the faces of his family, his friends, and the community he had once taken for granted. In that moment, he knew he was no longer the angry boy who had picked a fight with an old man. He was something more, something better. What did you think of Bryce's journey? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one.